Alrighty, sorry for the delay, chat. How y'all doing today? Okay. Welcome everyone to another Healthy Gamer GG stream. Just a reminder that everything we discuss on stream today is intended to be for educational and entertainment purposes only. Nothing is intended to be taken as medical advice, so if y'all have a question or concern, please go see a licensed professional and get yourself taken care of. Very, very important, right? If y'all are struggling with something like depression or anxiety, you're not even sure, then go get evaluated. And they're the ones that will sort of tell you, hey, maybe there is something going on, and hey, here's what we can do to help. So please go see a licensed professional if y'all have any specific medical concerns or questions. So we're probably going to be out next week. So probably going to stream on Wednesday, maybe out on Friday, maybe out next week. Stay tuned to our socials about our streaming schedule. Month of meditation week 3 is on. So if y'all are interested in developing a solid meditation practice, getting some, community support in terms of anchoring your behavior with other groups of people, that's going on Discord. So this week is going to be grounding meditation. So really, really good for people who are, struggling to get out of their own head, need to sort of take a break from their life and just kind of need to ground and center. And so Healthy Gamer Bot has been meditating for the month of meditation and has gained consciousness. And the meditation Discord, the Healthy Gamer Discord bot has a puzzle for you. And I suppose that the answer is one of the biggest reveals in HG history. And so I guess y'all can try to solve the puzzle bot, the bot that has the puzzle, or the puzzle that the bot gives you. I think that'll probably go live after stream, okay? So today, we're going to talk about a couple of interesting things. First, we're going to talk a little bit about Karens and what's going on with Karens. What is a Karen? What's going on in the head of a Karen? And more importantly, why they seem to be acting up more, why are they more prevalent, what's going on? So we're going to try to understand the psychology of the phenomenon that is a Karen. We're also going to be taking a really interesting look at a very common phenomenon, which is why it can be harder to get over almost relationships than real ones, right? So sometimes it's kind of interesting, but the hardest things to get over can be not full-fledged relationships, but the start of relationships, right? It's the potential of a relationship when you meet someone and y'all have a couple of interactions, or maybe even you go on a date or two, you hang out for a little while. Sometimes it's kind of bizarre, but when things when things kind of fall apart, right? Which is even sort of an overstatement because there was nothing there to fall apart. It can be really, really hard to get over. So sometimes there's this kind of paradoxical thing where people think that it's really silly that I'm having trouble getting over what my brain or what I imagine should be a logically insignificant interaction, right? It's not that big of a deal. It's not like we were married for 10 years. I went on 2 dates with this person. And yet I keep thinking about them. I can't get them out of my head. I feel like I've really missed out, right? So it's really interesting, but there's actually it's not illogical for you to experience that. And so we'll kind of get into what's going on in the brain, and we'll dig into a really, really important concept that I think people are not many people are aware of. So it's really, really, it's a critical concept called counterfactual thinking, and the role of counterfactual thinking in things like depression and anxiety and why we get hung up on that. And then if we have time, we're going to take a look at a couple of other things, okay? So this is where let's get started. So let's talk about the Karen. So I don't know if you guys know this, but recently, especially during the pandemic, Karens have been on the rise, right? So that we see more and more videos about Karens. And so generally speaking, what a Karen is someone who gets really upset at something and mistreats someone. Oftentimes the Karen is female, which we'll kind of get to in a second. Oftentimes the Karen is white, and even some people have defined Karen as being specifically a Caucasian or white person, so you can't have Karens of other race. We'll kind of dig into that a little bit. And then what happens is like these people are mistreating people. They're yelling, they're screaming, they're being generally mean. Another, really common sort of thing is like they want to speak to the manager. They're unwilling to like really understand that things are not the fault of the person that they're talking to, right? So like a classic Karen thing is like, I'm going to go to a pizza shop and order, or I'm going to go to a tire shop and order a pizza. And then like the tire shop is like, we don't sell pizza, we're a tire shop. And then the Karen gets really, really, really angry at the person who's like behind the desk. And so there's even like, I think there's some, even some really interesting, memes about this, right? So like one is, and so Karens are kind of like, what they tend to do is when they get denied something that they want, what they tend to do is try to appeal to higher authority or think that their way is the right way and that other people are objectively wrong. And we've even seen like some really good memes about Karens, right? So another important thing to consider is that the Karen is actually like an internet phenomenon, right? And so like this is the Elon Musk Karen. They also tend to be shown as having a particular kind of haircut. We'll even dig into why that is, okay? So I think there's truth to all these things. So this is where let's kind of just start by kind of understanding like a little bit about, what's going on with Karens. So the first thing is like, let's talk about features of a Karen. So Karens tend to be self-absorbed, right? So they're not very empathic. They tend to mistreat people who are like in the service industry or they view as like socially below them. When they get denied something that may not be out of any malicious intent, they tend to get like angry and explode at people. They also will oftentimes appeal to higher authority. And so they'll do things like call the police. They'll also like yell particular words that are grossly inappropriate to the situation, right? So if like, I saw some video where there was a black person who had asked a white woman to put their dog on a leash because it was, like that's the rules for the park that they were in. And then the woman started yelling rape and like the dude was super confused. And so they tend to like engage in very, very unhealthy or explosive or abusive behaviors. Generally speaking, they don't seem to be very happy. So kind of what's going on with a Karen. I also see the word narcissism tossed around a lot. So we're going to talk for a second about narcissism. So we're going to talk a little bit about, what are the characteristics of Karens? What do we know about certain personality characteristics that people may have and certain personality aspects that may apply to Karens? We're going to talk a little bit about how Karens form and how our impressions of Karens form. We're also going to touch on some of these more social implications, like issues of race or gender. That's definitely not my area of expertise. So I'm going to just kind of like really call attention to the fact that this exists, but it's not really something that we're going to sort of dive into. And then, we're going to talk a little bit about, and so then we'll kind of summarize like, why are Karens a thing? And even to a certain extent, why is their hair a particular way? So let's start by understanding narcissism. So a lot of people, when they see a Karen, they will say like, oh, this person is so self-absorbed, they're narcissistic. So we have to understand a couple of things about personality characteristics and personality disorders specifically. So if you look at statistics, 75% of people who get diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder are men, okay? So like for every 3 men that gets diagnosed, you get 1 woman who gets diagnosed with NPD. And there are other personality disorders, like borderline personality disorder, that I think basically has the flip ratio. So the majority of people who are diagnosed with borderline personality disorder are actually women. And so some people may wonder, is this like a gender bias? Is this a bias in the way that we diagnose things? Like what's going on here? So I want y'all we're going to sort of take a step back and look at the history of psychiatric diagnosis. And prior to our current system of diagnosis, we used to have something called the personality disorders used to be clustered. So there used to be cluster A personality disorders, cluster B personality disorders, and cluster C personality disorders. And back in this classification, cluster B included narcissism histrionic, which is like when you have grandiose kind of shows of things, and borderline personality disorder, as well as antisocial personality disorder. And so essentially what we kind of saw was that there was a gender split in the cluster B personality disorders, that narcissists and sociopaths tended to be more men, right? So like the majority of people who get diagnosed with these things are men. And the majority of people who get diagnosed with borderline personality disorder or histrionic personality disorder were women. But as like psychoanalysts and psychologists and like psychiatrists were looking at this kind of stuff, what they sort of realized is that there's a common root, which is why these got clustered together. And possibly due to the way that we get socialized and some other aspects of gender-specific things, that you can have a common root of like a lack of self-worth or an importance of other people treating you a particular way. That's kind of the core of all of these personality disorders. That depending on your upbringing in society, and even maybe to some degree like the effects of the Y chromosome and stuff like that, that this common root will manifest in one of two dimensions or directions. And if you're a man, it basically manifests as narcissism or antisocial personality disorder. If you're a woman, it's more likely to manifest as histrionic personality disorder or borderline personality disorder. So the common root, just to kind of explain this, is sort of this idea that like my self-worth is determined by how I am treated. So the way that I feel about myself depends on how other people treat me. So if I'm treated well, I feel good. If I'm treated poorly, I feel bad. And then each of these people, this is a little bit less true for antisocial personality disorder. I think that's in a lot of ways the odd one out. And then what a lot of people will do is engage in behaviors to correct this. So for example, when you have a histrionic person, this is someone who will like, cry wildly, will like, engage in just very drastic, overt shows of behavior, usually for the purpose of getting some kind of emotional support or like some kind of like love, essentially. So we'll also see this in people who have borderline personality disorder, where like if you try to break up with someone who has borderline personality disorder, or if you set some kind of limit on them, so you say, hey, I'm sorry, I can't talk right now, I'm busy, they will feel really, really bad. They'll feel very, very rejected. And as they feel rejected, they will engage in all manner of different kinds of behaviors to fix that. So if they want to talk to you, they want to talk to you, and they'll do whatever it takes to talk to you. And so over time, like they need you to talk to them, right? So that they really, really want to engage in this conversation. And if you set some kind of limit, they'll do all kinds of behaviors. On the one hand, they'll cry, they'll sort of like, sometimes they'll do things like threaten suicide, right? So I don't want you to leave me. So if you try to leave, I'll threaten suicide. Maybe they may actually feel like killing themselves in that moment. But the key thing is that when they threaten suicide, that changes the behavior of the other party. And then if you say, oh, no, don't do that. Okay, fine, I'll stay. And so they'll sort of be very kind of emotionally manipulative that way. So people on the other end of the spectrum feel very emotionally manipulated, right, if you're in a relationship with this person. But I don't think it's quite as malicious as people experience it as. These are just ways of getting our needs met. And so on the narcissistic side, for example, we'll also see similar things, but it's like, they'll get angry if someone threatens their credibility. They'll get angry if someone threatens their competence. They'll lash out. Oftentimes they won't cry. They'll do the kind of the opposite. They'll bully people, right? So one is kind of like this emotionally manipulative, kind of like being a vulnerable bully versus like an overt bully. And so as people sort of were looking at narcissism, they also realized the same thing is going on. Like, I need people to treat me with respect, and I'm going to do whatever I need to get the praise and affection of other people. So people who are narcissistic will brag, right? They'll show off. They'll show people how much money they have. They'll, make these really like out of touch statements. I recently saw a video about a guy who was like talking about how like, the ROI on cooking is really, really bad. So no one should ever cook if you want to make it big in life, right? So they'll have these like very interesting conclusions. I mean, there may be some validity to that statement on some level, but generally speaking, like narcissists will be big on show. And if we show, like if I show that I'm awesome and people are like, oh my God, you're so awesome, that'll kind of feed my narcissism. And then I feel good about myself because everyone is treating me well. So it's once again a behavioral reinforcement, because like if I show off and people respond to me positively, then that's going to reinforce my desire to show off more. Okay? So the key thing here is that the Karen is not really on the borderline, or sometimes they can be on the histrionic side, right? So like yelling randomly, like when someone is, telling you to put your dog on a leash is a good example of like histrionics. The interesting thing, though, is that Karens tend to be a little bit more on the narcissistic side, right? So they'll be very, very prideful, very angry, very blaming of other people. And that's generally speaking is more common in men than women, which probably has something to do with the way that the diagnosis was developed. So the early interviews and the early diagnostic criteria of narcissistic personality disorder was heavily influenced by men. So like people were, I don't mean that in a bad way, I mean that when people were looking at narcissism and trying to define the characteristics, they were interviewing primarily men. And so as they interviewed primarily men, they didn't really appreciate that there's a gender component to this. And so they selected for these things like grandiosity, which is a big part of the diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder, which is like less common in women, in female narcissists, but more common in male narcissists. Like grandiosity is a big part of it. So part of this diagnosis is kind of like, it's sort of like shaped in the way it has sort of an inherent gender built into it. And Karens are kind of like narcissistic, okay? So the other aspects of Karens that are kind of interesting is that they tend to have a sense of entitlement. Now, this is where a lot of people start to bring in race, socioeconomic status, and things like that, and for good reason. So Karens tend to be entitled. And what does that mean? So that means that when they show up somewhere, they expect something to happen and they believe that they deserve something, right? So if I show up at a tire store and I'm like, I want a pizza, like I deserve a pizza, and like it's not my mistake that I showed up at a tire store. It's your mistake for not providing me with pizza. And part of what we see here is sort of like this narcissistic defense mechanism where like the stupider you make a Karen feel, the more you kind of threaten them, the more of an explosion you're going to get from the Karen. So if a Karen goes to a tire store and they ask for pizza, that is objectively idiotic. The more of the objectively idiotic situation you put a Karen into, the more idiotic they are, the more of a Karen response you're going to get, right? So this is why, like, if you tell someone, hey, your dog needs to be on a leash, and like clearly the Karen is in the wrong, and this is what we see in Karen videos, right? Is like the Karen is clearly in the wrong. That's why it's really, really easy to hate Karens, because they're clearly in the wrong. It's really easy to make fun of them because they're clearly in the wrong. And because of the way that the kind of psychology of narcissistic defense mechanisms work, the more idiotic we make you feel, the more Karen behavior is going to come out, right? Because an apology is like out of the question. I'm like, so it's kind of bizarre. So this is what creates such an extreme scenario. So the size of the explosion is going to be correlated with the size of the idiocy. And furthermore, on the internet, we have something that selects for extremes, right? We don't select for like mild things. So what tends to happen on social media is what floats to the surface are the most extreme examples, which in turn gives this idea that Karens are like absolutely insane, right? Because we're sort of catching them at their lowest moments. Sure, they're responsible for sure. But Karens, I don't think are like, some of it is like personality, but some of it is like catching them on a bad day, right? So anyone we can kind of catch on a bad day and they're going to behave more extremely. The problem is that with the internet, what we tend to propagate is the most extremes. So if you look at like, an internet video of a particular person, chances are what you're going to find for any given random person, if you have a little bit of internet fame, chances are what you have internet fame for is one of the most extreme moments in your life, right? So if it's like, woman survives shark attack, and it's like a video of a woman, like everyone sees that video, and it's like that woman's life is not shark attack after shark attack after shark attack. But the way that the internet works, we tend to propagate the most extreme situations. So Karens are sort of placed in this situation where they're like, they feel like idiots, probably because they make some kind of mistake and someone's setting some kind of limit on them. Hopefully, I like to think compassionately for a second and think you catch them on a bad day. They have some kind of explosion. So let's talk a little bit about the explosion and what's going on there. So we're going to talk a little bit about entitlement, okay? So the other thing that Karens tend to do is they tend to have a lot of privilege, right? So they like feel entitled. So this study was looking at the psychology of what's called entrenched privilege, which is high socioeconomic status individuals from affluent backgrounds are uniquely high in entitlement. So this is also where there's this kind of this idea that a Karen is like a rich white woman, which I don't think is necessarily true because I've seen a lot of Karen behavior, like from people who are from lower socioeconomic statuses. And so the interesting thing that this paper sort of found is that the amount of entitlement that you have is not necessarily based on your socioeconomic status, which is interesting. It's based on the socioeconomic status that you grew up in. So what we tend to find is that people who are born into low socioeconomic status and become wealthy are not entitled. People who are born into low socioeconomic status and stay in low socioeconomic status are not entitled. But when you come from high socioeconomic status, that's what makes you entitled. So when you grow up with privilege, that's what gives you this idea, and it sort of makes sense, right? So if you grow up in a situation where your parents are able to provide for you Christmas presents without worrying about financial things, you will come to expect and even be entitled to Christmas gifts, right? The same is true of birthdays. If you come from a background where like birthday gifts, like you get a ton of gifts on your birthday, you will come to be entitled to and expect birthday gifts. So what we tend to find is that generally speaking, entitlement has to do with your background, which also we can sort of see kind of a racial component here, which is that generally speaking, if we look at, all of the ethnicities, Caucasians, I don't know if this statement is factually true. I think it is, but feel free to correct me. So generally speaking, I think the highest percentage of people, at least in the West, that come from high socioeconomic backgrounds are going to be Caucasian, right? So we can sort of start to see a little bit of a racial component here. The other interesting thing that's very fascinating is if we look at people who have high levels of entitlement, they are much more likely to respond to bad luck with anger, okay? So this really explains a lot about a Karen. So we have a Karen who probably grew up expecting a lot, right? Maybe was a someone. And this is where the narcissism also comes in, which is like, when I come from a prominent family and I used to be rich and I used to be a big deal, or I grew up in a southern town where my mom was this and my dad was this and my dad was like president of the Rotary Club. And then I kind of don't amount to much and I wind up in Walmart. Nothing against people who shop at Walmart. I shop at Walmart too on occasion. Like this kind of faded glory enhances this narcissism and it gives these people a sense of entitlement. And then what tends to happen is like sometimes it's not even your fault that you went to the tire store, right? Because the tire store is called Pizza Pie, right? Pizza Pie Tires. And it's like, or something like that. I don't know. And so then what happens is these Karens sometimes will genuinely face like bad luck. It's not their fault. Like if I go to a store and something is out of stock, right? It's not like my fault that they're out of stock. It's not the service person's like fault. Mario tires, perfect. It's not the service it's not like the checkout person's fault that something is out of stock. But my sense of entitlement when there are events that are not really against me in any way and I experience bad luck, I tend to have some kind of explosion. And so this is another thing that sort of contributes to the Karens is that generally speaking, something is wrong that starts the Karen off, right? It's not like the Karen just walks in, and maybe I could be wrong here, but generally speaking, there's something that like gets this going. Either the Karen makes a mistake, the Karen gets criticized in some way, the Karen feels afraid or something like that, they feel threatened, or there's like some kind of bad luck. What do you mean you're out of like my favorite coffee beverage? How dare you? And they'll sort of take it as a personal insult. There's something negative that happens, and then they tend to lash out at the person who's nearest to them. This is another area where I think the entitlement and sort of the hatred towards Karens really comes from, is what we usually see is that Karens are people who believe in like kind of a clear hierarchy. And so what they sort of probably, this has to do with developmental upbringing and stuff like that. They think that some people are above them and some people are below them. And so what we tend to see a lot of Karens doing is abusing people in the service industry, right? So there's like a waiter or a clerk or something like that who's really has no control over what the Karen wants. But the Karen just feels completely entitled to kind of like lash out at them. And this is where the let me speak to your manager kind of things comes from. So if we kind of tunnel down a little bit more, we can hypothesize a couple of other things. So let's talk about let me speak to your manager. So human beings tend to attribute the behavior to other people that other people engage in to their own psychology. So if someone does something, this is normal. So if someone does something, the intention behind that behavior is not based on my observation of that person, but is based on my own beliefs. So if someone waves to me, the meaning of that is going to be based on why would I wave to someone, okay? So we see a lot of these kinds of problems in like relationships and stuff when, for example, different things mean different things to different people. So for example, I've had relationships where people will get upset with me because I don't like call or text them on a regular basis. And for some people, calling or texting on a regular basis is a sign of caring about another person. So there's a behavior, and what that behavior means, the intention behind that behavior, or the meaning of that behavior is different to different people. Whereas like, I'm okay. Like if you don't text me for a month or even 3 months or a year, I've had friends that I haven't seen in like 2 years. I haven't even talked to them in 2 years. And we'll see each other after 2 years. And it's like, we pick up exactly where we left off. The time doesn't really mean much to me in terms of like the maintenance or importance of a relationship. The point is that different behaviors will mean different things to different people. And oftentimes what we'll see in Karens is that Karens will be like big into petty power plays and gatekeeping people and like other kinds of like petty kind of toxic behavior, which means that when they feel gate kept by someone, they're attributing their own intentions to that person, right? So like if I'm a Karen and I tend to be petty, like if it's like someone asks me for help, but like doesn't do it in, you know, a nice enough way and I feel offended, like I'm not going to help them. You know, I'm going to be like a petty overlord over my domain, and I'm going to gatekeep whenever I can. And so then what happens is when someone else sets a limit on them, they are attributing all of their own internal intentions to that person's behavior. And that oftentimes really upsets them. The other thing is that Karens also oftentimes, I mean, we've never interviewed a Karen, right? So we don't really know here, but this is all kind of hypothesis based on some scientific studies and observations of behavior. So the other thing is that Karens tend to think that they're objectively right? So like if they're entitled, they're like, this is the way of the world. Like I deserve a pizza, whether it's a tire shop or whatever. For some reason, they've grown up in a particular way where the world needs to conform to my wants. This is a key concept that they've kind of grown up with. And chances are they grew up in a household where like this was happening, right? So there was a domineering figure in the household. And when they were a kid, what they wanted didn't matter. And there's a powerful person in the household. There's a powerful person in the hierarchy. And what they want, their word is law. And so as the Karen assumes that role, as they grow into the parent, they start behaving the same way because that's the rules of the world that they were taught. And so they sometimes feel like this petty person is gatekeeping me. I'm better than this person. I don't need to listen to this person. This person must be incompetent because they're not providing me with what I want. I feel entitled. I get angry. So let me talk to your manager, because surely someone with more power and more competence than you is more likely to agree with me, right? That's the idea behind the Karen, is because like I'm objectively right. So the more powerful you get and the smarter you get, the more likely they are to fix this problem on my behalf. Now, the other challenging thing here is that sometimes that behavior gets reinforced, right? So like this is the kind of thing where like talking to a manager can be sort of assuaging for your ego to begin with. And the manager comes out and apologizes or maybe fixes the problem or does some kind of override that the lower person couldn't do. But sometimes this behavior gets reinforced, right? By talking to the manager and making enough of a hissy fit, I actually get what I want. So throwing temper tantrums, why do people throw temper tantrums? Because they get us what we want, right? This kind of goes back to what we were saying at the beginning about narcissism and borderline and histrionic, that if a behavior gets rewarded, even if it's a nasty behavior, that behavior is going to get reinforced. So why do they ask for managers? Because sometimes asking for managers works, right? So we've conditioned Karens. So that's sort of the psychology of a Karen. Now we're going to look at a couple of other dimensions. So one is that there seems to be a racial component to Karen. So some people even define Karens as, first of all, women, and second of all, white. And so we're going to kind of take a quick look at this paper. And so the angry Karen is invoked to indicate her manipulation of her racial power, but she is equally significant, we suggest, for her positioning within a pre-existing antagonistic service economy. So this is a paper that's sort of talking a little bit about racial components to Karenism, which I think is like very possible, or a component of it. So as the term has grown, I think it started to encompass men and people of different ethnicities. It's not my place to say, that this is right or wrong. I think if we look back at sort of tracing the etiology or the origin of the word Karen, I think it actually started on Twitter in predominantly black communities talking about white people and their experience of working with entitled white women. So, I'm not saying that Karen's going to be exclusively white. It's not my place to make that judgment. I think that there are definitely racial components to this. But it's unclear to me. I don't think there's real, science that's been done on this. People have made observations and terms tend to evolve and stuff like that. And clearly, Elon Musk being a Karen sort of suggests that, he's white, but he's not a woman. And so I've seen also on social media videos of non-white women being Karens as well. But there's definitely seems to be sort of a shared experience or common experience that Karens are oftentimes white. And that may in turn have to do with things like socioeconomic status or entitlement, which may be more correlated with Caucasian ethnicity as opposed to other ethnicities. So it sort of makes sense to me. But I don't think it's necessarily white. I think it's these other constituent components that are correlated with race. The next thing is that there are even tones now of different kinds of, once again, racial, this doesn't sort of talk about it, but they're racial components, but there are also starting to be gender components of Karens. So sometimes misogynistic people will use, or people with misogynistic attitudes will use the term of Karen, right? So it's also become a vehicle that has been co-opted for misogyny. The interesting thing is that there are terms that have been co-opted for misandry as well, right? So I think incel and simp are two words that, for example, have been co-opted, right? So these are things that now, if people have misandric views, they'll sort of use these kinds of terms as a way to blame the person for being this thing, which is actually a mask for my anti-gender language. Okay? So we're just going to kind of touch on that. There are definitely racial and gender components to Karen, not my area of expertise. So next thing that we're going to talk a little bit about is why are Karens on the rise and what's going on. So next thing to talk a little bit about is online presence. So I think part of the reason that we've seen so many more Karens recently is that a couple of things. So the first is that we've seen a rise of Karens during the pandemic, okay? And so I think this has a lot of really, really interesting connotations to it. The first is that the pandemic was an inordinate amount of stress on people as a whole. So when you stress the whole population, right, the people who have these Karen tendencies are going to respond to the stress in a particularly negative way, okay? So the first thing is that the world was worse for everyone, and everyone is getting worse. So we saw, increases up to, even by some statistics, 300% increases in things like depression and anxiety. So we're going to see different people respond to stress in different ways. So some people get depressed, some people get anxious. We also saw, an increase in suicidal ideation. Unclear whether there was really an increase in total net suicides. I haven't seen the data on that. But we're also seeing an increase in Karen-like behavior, right? Being angry, entitled. The other thing to remember is that the pandemic also had other influences besides stress on Karen explosions. Because remember that the pandemic resulted in more people having bad luck, right? So the likelihood that stores were closed, the likelihood that they didn't have your product in stock, people are out sick, so things are taking longer at restaurants, right? People are understaffed, they can't work. all kinds of changes happened that made the world objectively like a harder place to live in. And if we remember about people with entitlement who experience bad luck respond with anger, the pandemic is going to increase that kind of relationship, okay? So the pandemic is sort of like, it's stressful mentally, but also objectively and physically and in the world, Karens have more things to be upset about, right? So when these two things come together, they're going to increase Karen-like behavior, which is part of the reason why I think we saw such an explosion of Karen stuff on social media. Which brings me to the last point that we're going to talk about Karens, which is online drift. So the other thing that's kind of going on the internet, so there's even some studies that sort of show that participation in particular kinds of social media activities are more likely to engage in like entitlement behavior. So like mask mandates and sheeple and things like that is a good example of this, where if people are talking about, like, for example, there were particular groups, social media groups that cause people to become radicalized. And oftentimes Karens are a part of those groups, right? So now, for example, like when a Karen walks into a restaurant that has a mask mandate, as a result of the radicalization of online drift, that Karen is much more likely to explode. So what does that mean? The radicalization of online drift. So generally speaking, there is a surface of the internet. And the surface of the internet is generally speaking like pretty acceptable. And then what we see on the internet, and there have been really good studies done about this, that what happens over time is like I start out up here, but over time I'll like drift deeper into the internet and into more radical extremes, okay? So like a good example of this is like, you can start out on Google or Wikipedia, which is like relatively neutral. But as you move from platforms or even things like Twitter, where as you move from platforms like Twitter to Reddit to Discord to specific Discords to, like 4chan, 8chan, like, 8chan is just twice as much as 4chan, right? So like what happens is like we'll move to more radical platforms that are more like echo chambers and will actually like radicalize our thinking. So this is something that it doesn't also have to be in that sort of way. So the other way, the interesting thing, we should maybe do an experiment on this. Or if you go on YouTube, you'll also go down like radicalization algorithms, right? So if you watch a single video on a particular topic, YouTube will start pushing you in that direction. So if you watch a single topic about, let's say like an inflammatory video about feminism, or misandry, like you'll start going down a particular way. If you watch something that is misogynistic, you'll start getting fed like other misogynistic videos. If you start watching like, so I would sometimes watch cooking videos. And so like now like half of my YouTube suggestions are like people grilling things, okay? And like it starts out with like a very simple grilling thing, but then like over time, we're getting into like hardcore grilling in my YouTube algorithm. My YouTube algorithm is super confused though, because my wife watches stuff on it, my kids watch stuff on it. So the YouTube doesn't know what to serve us. It doesn't know if we want a video about grilling steak, like nursery rhymes, or like Dota VODs, or makeup tutorials. Like my YouTube algorithm is so confused, right? But what happens with Karens is that they tend to engage in social communities, online social communities, where there's a heavy amount of drift and radicalization, which then like changes the way they view the world. And then when they go interact in public, right? So if I am participating in like racially discriminatory groups, or like where hate speech, anti-black people, and I'm walking in the park without a dog, with my dog off the leash, and a black man walks up to me and asks me to put the dog on the leash, all of that radicalization is going to come to a head, combined with the narcissistic injury of me breaking a rule. And since I'm racist, a black person telling me about rules, like how dare they, right? And so then I'm going to explode, and then it gets captured on social media. Then it gets posted somewhere. Everyone sees it. And then what do you think happens to a Karen who sees themselves on social media? Because now we're going to come full circle. Right? So what happens? The narcissistic injury gets way worse, right? They feel more hurt. And the more hurt they feel, the more of an idiot they seem, they radicalize even further, right? They become even more narcissistic. And then they're like, how dare they? Now it's like these young kids on the internet, right? And now they're poo-pooing millennials and Gen Z because the millennials made me look like an idiot. And so it kind of like, it just loops. And so like this phenomenology of Karens is really fascinating. I don't know how much of what I'm saying is actually like scientifically valid, right? So it's like, this is the kind of thing where we have to extrapolate. There aren't studies. I mean, there are studies. We looked at a couple. But the truth is that it's a complex phenomenon that involves all kinds of things. It probably starts with some amount of personality characteristics. It probably starts with a particular kind of upbringing that leads to a sense of entitlement, which may have something to do with socioeconomic status, may have something to do with race. And then as we start to add some of these issues about stress from the pandemic, the way that stress manifests, even bad luck, and then when we toss on a couple of other, lighter fuel on the flame, the first bit of lighter fuel is the internet, where the most extreme content becomes normalized. And then we get an impression that this is what Karens are behaving like day in and day out, right? Whereas hopefully, thankfully, I think, people are not, this isn't happening every day to people. I mean, we encounter it from time to time. Everyone encounters it from time to time. But the internet is all about making the extreme and rare very, very common, right? That's what we get propagated on. This is really simple. Like even for, dozens now. So like for 20 years, if you look at things like Facebook. So Facebook early on, when we were looking at the early impacts of mental health on Facebook, or even things like Twitch, this applies to basically all the platforms, where like I log on, it's my birthday one day out of 365 days a year. But every day I log on and I see like people celebrating their birthdays, it makes me feel like people are just having the time of their life all the time. Because the things that are most upvoted, the things that are liked the most are the things that are going to show up on my feed. And so one thing from each person on how many people I'm friends with is going to show up on my feed once a year, one birthday. But what it looks to me is I'm only celebrating my birthday one day out of 365, and all these people are constantly celebrating birthdays and constantly having a good time. So the extremes rise to the top and give us an unfair perspective on what the world is actually like. So this is why like spending time on the internet skews our view. That combined with things like online drift and online radicalization, when Karens participate in these online communities where, the people are being racially attacked constantly. And let's remember that these online communities don't really think critically, right? And the ones that we're a part of, you may think, the Karens, they're not thinking critically, but I guarantee you the community you're in right now doesn't think critically either. That's just not how they work. So if I go onto the Dota 2 subreddit and make a post about LOL, I played both of these games for 5 years. I objectively think that LOL is better. Here's why. I'm going to get downvoted into oblivion. No one's going to take that seriously. I can go onto the LOL subreddit and do the same thing. I played both of these games, and you can make the same exact post. And if you post it in the Dota 2 subreddit, Dota 2 is better than LOL, you're going to get 1,000 upvotes. If you post it in the LOL subreddit, you're going to get 10,000 downvotes because the LOL community is so much bigger. Right? So this is where this is going to happen in online communities, and we're not actually that different. So this online drift sort of reinforces the ideas that a Karen has. And then once we make fun of the Karens, right, because we don't treat them with compassion. So if I had to ask y'all, my sense is that the person who is the least deserving, the class of people who is the least deserving of compassion are Karens, right, on the internet. And so this is just a consequence of the world that we live in. So that's what I'm thinking about Karens. Hopefully that'll help you understand. Last thing, I'll kind of give you hopefully some tips about how to deal with a Karen in the wild, but unclear whether these will actually work. So the first thing is to remember that a Karen is not a person, it's a state. I believe this. It's a state of mind. So this goes back to something that I remember learning in medical school, where there aren't good doctors and bad doctors. That's actually not true. There are. But generally speaking, there are good doctor days and bad doctor days, right? All doctors have good days. All doctors have bad days. And if you're a patient who encounters a doctor on a bad day, you're going to conclude that this is a bad doctor. The truth is there are good doctor days and there are bad doctor days. Now, there are bad doctors. There are some doctors who have such a high amount of bad doctor days and make, bad medical decisions on a consistent basis that they're bad doctors. But generally speaking, I think that's true. So remember to try to have a little bit of compassion for the Karen, right? So I think this is the kind of thing where like making them feel stupid may make you feel good, but it's probably not going to help the situation. That being said, it is important to set good boundaries with a Karen, right? So this is where like I personally like it when managers have their employees back and don't reinforce the behavior of the Karen. Do something good for the world and don't appease them. And at the same time, treat them with a compassion, right? So this is one of the most challenging things that you can do. So one of the hardest skills to learn is how to be compassionate while maintaining your boundaries. So the two tend to like feel different, right? So for people who, when we be nice, we tend to like compromise our boundaries. Oh yeah, it's okay. Don't worry about it. You don't have to get me something for, my birthday, even though I've gotten you things for your birthday for the last 3 years. It's okay. Or what we do is we get mad at people and then we lack compassion. So, try to recognize that they're having a bad day, enforce your boundary, hold it, and they may explode, and then, there's nothing else you can do about that, which is why I think that this sort of, got to take this with a grain of salt. Because I think for some of the videos that I've seen of like Karens exploding, like I don't think that that's, strong behavioral reinforcement, like kicking them out, calling the police, those are going to be your only options. But I do think that the world, maybe you can prevent things from getting to that point by trying to be just a little bit more compassionate. Questions? Is there a guidebook to Karens? No, I think this video is like the first attempt at something like that, right? Do Karens smell fear? Absolutely. So I know it sounds like a funny question, but I think so. So I think a lot of people, if you look at cluster B personality disordered people, they're very, very good at detecting particular things in other human beings. So this is kind of a weird study that I've cited before. So they took a group of people with borderline personality disorder. And what they when you say can they smell fear, you have no idea how right you are. So they took people with borderline personality disorder and they filmed a regular face that was smiling going to a frown. So smiling, I hate you, right? So if you take that video of me smiling to being angry and you split it up into 100 still photographs, and somewhere in the middle is going to be a half smile and half frown, right? So if you take a normal person, as in a person who doesn't have a personality disorder, their brain cannot detect the anger until you're after the halfway point. So when we're at 51 to 60% angry from smiling, when we're less than half smiling and more than half angry, then a normal brain detects anger. For someone who has BPD, they detect anger at 20 to 30%, right? So this is actually like, it's not, when we say normal brain, I'm not saying their brain is like abnormal or ill or anything. Their brain has grown up to be more sensitive. It's actually, its detection capability is superior to a normal brain. So they can actually detect a negative emotion faster, which can be really, really challenging and also sort of makes sense, right? So if I'm a narcissist and someone is going to disrespect me, I can't wait until they're at 51% disrespect to act, right? The second I detect 20 or 30%, this is why we say narcissists are sensitive. So if you have a compliment, but you don't emotionally, like that praise is not authentic or genuine, like the narcissist will detect it. They'll say like, what's wrong, right? And if y'all have been in a relationship with someone who's got cluster B something and they're like, tell me what's wrong. And you're like, nothing's wrong. Everything's fine. Because you're at 51% happy, 60% happy, 70% happy. But they're still able to detect that 20 to 30% unhappiness. Then they keep asking you, what's wrong? What's wrong? What's wrong? And then they push you and push you and push you. You feel more frustrated. And then finally it comes out. And then the person is like, haha, I knew it all along. I knew that nastiness was in there. I knew you were upset with me. I knew you were mad at me. And so then the behavior gets reinforced. The bias gets confirmed. And then they do it again. So can Karen smell fear? I think so. I really think so. I think they can detect when a particular behavior will work. right? So if they smell fear, they're going to escalate their bullying because they know it'll work. And they may be able to detect it 30%, 40% fear, even when you're 70% confident. You're waffling a little bit. They'll smell it and they'll go for it. Questions? Okay, my question is, when talking about empathy in a person, be empathic, do they need to be born with it, or is it a skill that most people can learn? Both. So your upbringing will sort of naturally get you to a certain level of empathy. But the cool thing that we've learned is that EQ, or emotional quotient, which is like IQ, can actually be developed. So it's our hypothesis that improvements in our coaching program, the single variable that is the most universal about how our coaching program helps people is by boosting EQ. Can you detect 30 to 40% without having BPD? Sure. It depends on how your brain was wired. Okay, these are important questions. So I constantly ask my girlfriend what's wrong because I feel like she's actually upset. Does that suggest that I might be a narcissist? So remember that the labels are constellations of things, but the thing does not necessarily mean that you have the label. Okay? So for example, in depression, we can see weight gain. But everyone who gains weight does not have depression. Does that make sense? There are all kinds of reasons why you might have depression. There are all kinds of reasons why, if your girlfriend, you constantly ask your girlfriend what's wrong because I feel like she's actually upset. Does that suggest I might be a narcissist? Not really, because there are lots of reasons why you would constantly ask your girlfriend why she's upset. So I would not come away with this with a label. So the diagnosis of a personality disorder certainly can't be done by listening to a dude talking on stream. And even in a clinical setting, generally speaking, requires 6 months of observation. So the gold standard for diagnosing a personality disorder requires 6 months of psychiatric observation or treatment. Okay? And why is that? It's because remember that narcissism is a defense mechanism. So everyone has it. So why do you need 6 months? You need to track someone over time because you could be catching them at a bad point. When they're under a lot of stress, they may seem narcissistic, they may seem borderline, but that's an effect of the stress. And once the stress goes away, they're kind of back to normal. People who have true personality disorders, which remember is like somewhere around 4.8%, 4 to 7% of the population. So exceedingly small, right? So chances are there's like a 5% chance that you have this. So it's low. 95% chance that you don't have it. And so we can sort of respond with these defense mechanisms, but the personality disorder is diagnosed when this is kind of your default state. Can people with ASPD develop or learn empathy? Sort of. So it depends on the person. So in my experience, I've seen 2 classifications of ASPD, which is antisocial personality disorder. One is where there's like really something going on in their brain that makes it very, very hard, or I would even say like damn near impossible to learn empathy. But there are a lot of people who get diagnosed with stuff who are not like that. So this is the other thing to remember about psychiatric diagnoses is they're patterns that we've recognized. So it's not like some of these binary questions will be yes or no. It's not like a stroke, where a stroke is like a discrete physical thing that we can track to a particular part of the brain and be very predictive about what it's going to do to you. Whereas for things like ASPD, these are like psychiatrists have made observations. We don't have biopsies. We don't have x-rays. So I'm not saying they're not real things, but they're not as deterministic as other diseases. If you know you've become a sociopath, is there a way to rewire your brain to feel emotions like you should? Yeah, so let's talk about this. So if you know you have become a sociopath, the first question is, how do you know you've become a sociopath? See, I think y'all are hopefully making this mistake, because it's a good mistake to make. So if you've been evaluated for 6 months or a year by a clinician, and they've diagnosed you with antisocial personality disorder, and they say you are a sociopath, that's one thing. But a lot of times what happens, this is exactly why we say, like, we don't just use that medical disclaimer as like a, cover your ass thing. This is important to understand. Because a lot of people run around diagnosing themselves as sociopaths. Well, how did you come to that conclusion? Well, because I don't feel emotions. So this is exactly what happens. Is what people do is they'll pick one symptom and then they'll arrive at a diagnosis. Oh, because I can't feel emotions, I'm a sociopath. But what you have to remember is that inability to feel emotions has a differential diagnosis. So maybe you're depressed. Maybe you're numb. Maybe you're using substances. Maybe you're alexithymic. So that's why I'm kind of saying, like, even for people who have come into my office with a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder, I found that there's actually two groups. One is like where there's some of this other stuff going on, like emotional numbness, which over time, like once we uncover that stuff, then they're able to like feel emotions and stuff like that. Whereas the other group like really has trouble with that. So I don't really know about that group. Right? So if you say, if you know you have become a sociopath, is there a way to rewire your brain? I'd say, like, unless you have a really, really good reason, which is I concluded is not a good reason. If you're using a label of sociopath, that needs to be assigned by someone who knows what it is and knows how to evaluate it from it properly. Not, this is what I think a sociopath is. I've watched 1,000 videos on YouTube, therefore I know. I'm not saying that your experience doesn't resonate with those things, but that's why differential diagnosis is so important. I'd say the biggest thing that people miss on the internet is the concept of differential diagnosis. Who the hell has money or resources to track a person for 6 months? Do all countries do this? No, I mean, so it's not money or resources to track a person. It's like you engage in therapy for like 6 months and then you arrive at a diagnosis, right? So it's like 6 months is, what, 24 weeks? So I'd say about 20 appointments is what it takes on average. Can you preemptively correct the behavior of a Karen while they aren't in a Karen state? Absolutely. That's my hypothesis anyway. And in fact, I think that gets done the majority of the time. Here's the problem. Every time we diffuse a Karen bomb, it never gets uploaded to the internet, right? So there's a huge selection bias. Because I think most Karens are getting diffused. And so you can hopefully diffuse a Karen. I mean, I could be wrong there, right? Because we don't have data on that. So just because we don't have data on it doesn't mean that that's true, but we also have to be careful about selection bias. Because all the Karens that we see are the ones that were not diffused. They're all the explosions. And then we get this idea that, oh, explosion after explosion after explosion, this is an undifusable bomb. All right, it's sort of like what people say about the CIA, which is all you hear about is the CIA's screw-ups. And here's another... I don't know if y'all have seen this, but so this is a good example of this is survivorship bias. So have you guys seen this thing? So this was like during World War I or II or something like that. What they sort of found is that all the planes that came home had damage here. So this is all the planes that kind of came home had damage in these parts. So what I think the military engineers concluded, these are the parts that are the most likely to get hit. Therefore, we should reinforce these parts of the plane. Okay? But the interesting thing is that, like, these are not the parts that you need to reinforce. The parts that you need to reinforce are actually here, 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 and here. Because all the planes that didn't come home got hit in these places. Therefore, these are actually the most critical areas. So this is part of the problem with selection bias. We see the same thing with Karen, right? All the Karens that we see are the ones that exploded. So we have a selection bias that it may not actually be like representative. Okay? Oh my God, catching up to chat. Yeah, so people are like, I like dark humor. Do I have autism? I have no idea, man. This is why for all of you that are asking, am I something? You should go see a clinician because they're the ones that can tell you, right? What does chat do if they find themselves being a Karen? I think just take a step back, take a deep breath, recognize that you feel upset, right? Recognize that the world doesn't owe you something, or even if it does owe you something, that it's not necessarily the person in front of you's fault that you're not getting it. Does this mean that 5 to 7% of chat are Karens? No, because remember, this is selection bias, right? So 5% of the population are Karens. But Twitch chat may not be the same as the general population. So it's very possible that all of the Karens are out there asking to speak to retail store employees, managers, instead of watching this stream. So I would suggest that we actually have a lower percentage of Karens than the average population. Right? I also think that, like, you know, people in this community who are learning, which you all do, are less likely to engage in Karen-like behavior. Yeah, so when people say, you know, that's good, what about asking for an admin, right? So, like, we may see Karens on the Discord, right? So, like, that probably happens for sure. I know it happens, right? So some people feel entitled. They don't really see what they're doing is wrong, right? Which is okay. Like, it's part of life. Like, I'm not blaming people for being that way. It's because as we're seeing, so if you go back to that paper that we looked at about socioeconomic status, you know, your risk for being a Karen is influenced by things that are completely out of your control. Like, what was the socioeconomic status that you grew up in? That has nothing to do with you not having control over that. But we also know that entitlement comes with growing up in a high SES background. What if we tell a Karen to just chill? That, generally speaking, is going to have the opposite result. So telling people to just chill is one of the worst things you can say to someone who's stressing out. Very invalidating. If they could just chill, they would not be doing that, right? They wouldn't be in that situation. Yeah, Karens make my blood boil just watching clips of them more than anything else I can think of. That is exactly why you see so many clips of them, right? Do y'all understand that? Like, the reason that we see so many clips of things that make our blood boil is because that is how the platform engages you. That's a win for the platform, because now they've gotten you to spend an additional 60 seconds, 90 seconds, 120 seconds. And remember that all the platforms are warring for your attention. So Reddit has ads, Facebook has ads, Twitch has ads, YouTube has ads. So your 90 seconds, your 1 minute, your 2 minutes, your 3 minutes, your 5 minutes, who gets that ad revenue? Because if you're on the internet, someone's getting revenue. So they're fighting over that revenue. And as they're fighting over it, oh, look, lots of people, like, and we see all these, like, up 50,000 upvotes, 80,000 upvotes of this Karen on an airplane getting taken off of an airplane. Oh my God, the social justice boner. It's so good, right? That sense of righteousness. And Reddit gets money. Great, fantastic. Let me show you more. Oh, you really liked that video? Let me show you more. That turn you on? Let me show you more. Y'all get it? Can we as a society fix entitlement? No. Entitlement can't be fixed on the society level. It has to be fixed on an individual level. Right? Okay. What do y'all think? Should we move on? Yeah, so this is the kind of thing. So, you know, we talk about AoE healing. But I mean, I think at the end of the day, like, our unit is the individual, right? That's, I mean, I'm not saying that that's the best unit. That's just the one that I'm the most familiar with. Like, you know, monk training is not about saving the world. It's about saving yourself. And being a doctor is about saving individuals. So, do you feel like other countries have less Karens due to personal responsibility being part of their culture? I would imagine so. I imagine Karens are very cultural. But I don't know. I didn't see any papers about cross-cultural Karenism. Okay. All right. This is a good one. Let me drink some water, collect myself. Okay, this one we may need. Give me a second, chat. Okay. So we need this. Okay. Give me a second. I'm just resting my voice so I don't cough. Okay. All right. So now what we're going to do, we're going to take a quick look at something that's really, really interesting, which is that some people have this phenomenon where they have more trouble getting over an almost relationship than a real relationship. That sometimes we get more hung up on things that could have been that we've lost than things that we had and we lost. And when we this is something that, I don't know if y'all have experienced this. Like, I remember when I was like 13 or 14, I was at an Indian wedding. And I was at this Indian wedding and I met this girl in the stairwell. Like, because like the kids were hanging out in the stairwell, like, the adults were doing their things. There's like a stairwell where it's like, weddings, like there are places that kids hang out and places that adults hang out. So there are kids hanging out at the stairwell. And I met this girl and I talked to her like for 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes, maybe half an hour. I don't remember. But we just kind of like hung out because we were the two people there that were like teenagers. And she was, dressed up at an Indian wedding. So she was pretty and she was probably like 15, 14, my age. I don't know exactly. And then for some reason, like that encounter was like really powerful. And I was thinking about that girl after that. And I was like, I wonder where she is. Like even to this day, I'll sometimes wonder where she ended up and what she's doing. And I kind of noticed like, it's sort of weird that like, I feel really, really attached to this kind of relationship. And then what happens is if we sort of like look at these like relationships that never really happened. That girl was not Kruti, by the way, so I did not end up marrying her. I never saw her again. I have no idea what her name is or where she is. So what happens then is like we get really confused with ourselves, right? So why do we get so hung up on things that never happened? I met someone, so I tend to think about romance because that was an experience I had, but we also have these kinds of thoughts about other things like, oh, if I had majored in this, then I would have done this. If I had done this, or if I had told my brother many years ago, like when I was in college, a friend of mine approached me and was like, hey man, I'm starting a company. Like I want you with me. But I was so close to graduating. I gave it up. I didn't join a startup. And if I had joined the startup, I would be rich today and I would be retired. So we have like all these regrets. And so what's going on there? Why is it? And then we feel like idiots, right? Because like a relationship that I've been in for a year should be worth more to me, should be harder to get over because that's a real relationship, right? So getting over things that are real, is easier or should be easier than getting over things that never were. And yet we have this experience where like having a couple of dates, like we had this thing going with a girl, like I was talking to her, I was talking to this guy, we were vibing, we were hanging out a little bit, they disappeared, I never saw them again. I'm really, really bent out of shape and like, I don't understand why, like I shouldn't feel this way, okay? But it turns out that there actually are a lot of really good reasons why we get hung up on almost relationships over real relationships. So the first thing that we're gonna talk about is the honeymoon phase, okay? And then what we're going to do is talk about grief and acceptance. And then we're actually going to spend the majority of our time talking about something called counterfactual thinking, which is a under advertised concept, which has been very, very scientifically validated and gives us a lot of insight into like how this stuff works. So the first thing to understand is the honeymoon phase. So we all know that relationships have a honeymoon phase, right? So what character, like in the honeymoon phase, like we tend to overlook each other's flaws. It's easy to be on our best behavior. And so the relationship is in its like nicest part, right? And so even when we think about the term honeymoon, the honeymoon is what you do immediately after marriage, where mortgages haven't set in, career challenges haven't set in, health challenges haven't set in, kids hopefully haven't set in, or maybe have, maybe haven't, who knows? Right? So the honeymoon is like the best time. So if you really think about it, some of the sweetest part of a relationship is like the forming of the relationship. And the fact that it's so positive in your mind is part of the reason that you move towards it, right? If it wasn't like an overwhelmingly positive experience, you may not engage in the relationship to begin with. So early on, if you knew all of the negatives about a particular person, like you would be less likely to engage in that relationship. So what tends to happen is we tend to front load the positivity, we get emotionally invested, and then we start to like roll out the negative aspects of the relationship. We start to learn, we start to let ourselves go a little bit. It's like first date, flowers. Second date, maybe flowers too. Third date, fourth date, eighth date, ninth date, 10th date, 11th date, 12th date, flowers every single time. That's excessive. Then flowers start coming at Valentine's Day, first Valentine's Day, second Valentine's Day, third Valentine's Day. Sixth Valentine's Day, seventh Valentine's Day, maybe you start to let it slip, right? So there's absolutely this honeymoon phase. And so the key thing to understand about the honeymoon phase is that it's the best. It tends to be, really dominated by positivity. So the first thing that I want y'all to understand is that like, if you lose out on something during the honeymoon phase, what is the value of that thing? Because a honeymoon relationship is all positive, right? It's just straight positive. It's all green. But as time goes on, what we'll start to see is that like a real relationship starts to get filled in with some red and some green, right? There are some ups and there are downs. Is your partner perfect? When do people think that their partner is perfect? At the beginning of the relationship. Oh my God, I met this person. Oh, you guys can't see this. Sorry, whoops. I met this person. They're the one. They're perfect. When do people say things like that? Here, right? And then we start whining about them. We start bitching about them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so then what happens is like, this relationship is perfect. So the first thing to understand is during the honeymoon phase, if we lose something, it's kind of like worth more than the real thing in our mind, right? Because it's straight positive. So it's sort of like if you think about it, what's worse to lose? If I have a backpack that has $5 in it, that is sad to lose. But if I have a backpack that has $500,000 in it, that feels way worse to lose. Right? So in the first phase, like I know it sounds kind of weird, but like the value of the early relationship is at its height. So losing something when it has so much potential is actually like, it can oftentimes be more of a loss. Because the other problem with honeymoon phases and the potential is when we're thinking about the potential, we tend to think about all the positives. So when I think about, oh my God, this is the one, like I've met her, she's amazing, or he's amazing. And then you start imagining all these things. Right? You imagine, oh my God, they love Europe. I love Europe. We're going to go travel in Europe. Or I love tacos. They love tacos. We can travel to Mexico. But when you're imagining that stuff, you don't think about missing your flight because they didn't show up at the airport on time. You don't think about all the anger that's going to start when you have to stay at the airport for 12 hours, take a different flight, lose a day or a trip just because they were not at the airport on time. You don't think about all that stuff. So at the early stages of the relationship in the honeymoon, it's all potential, it's all positivity. So when we lose that, I know it sounds kind of weird, but like losing this hurts more than losing the other thing. Okay? So that's the honeymoon phase. Second thing we're going to talk about is grieving. So if we think about moving on, right? So the idea here is that we want to move on from relationships. And sometimes what happens is when we have these like almost relationships, they're actually harder to move on from. So what's going on there? Why is it hard to move on from almost relationships? And I know it sounds kind of weird, but in a real relationship, it has a start and it has an end. When a real relationship ends, you have something to grieve. You have something to mourn, and you have something to accept, right? The relationship is over. It's like start and finished. So in your mind, it's like, okay, I spent 2 years with this person. You know, it's really sad that things are over now, but it's over. And so you can kind of accept that and you can sort of move on. The thing about these almost relationships is that they don't really have a start and they don't really have an end, right? So like there's no starting point and no ending point. And if there isn't a discrete start or end, it's really hard to like grieve something because this is a potential that is lost, right? So it's kind of weird, but like we also see this in parents who lose children. Like the reason that it's so hard to get over a child's loss as opposed to, you know, a spouse's loss is I'm sure there's a genetic biological component to it. But there's like all of that unspent potential. And that unspent potential makes it harder for us to grieve because we haven't seen the end of it. So grieving is really about seeing the end of something and being able to accept that something is over. But if it never happened in the first place, oddly enough, for some weird psychological reason that I haven't really seen a great explanation for beyond what I'm sort of explaining now, having an end to something is important for something to grieve. And this is also why if we look at the relationships that we get stuck in, it's not just these almost relationships, it's relationships that don't have ends, right? So these on again, off again relationships, or these kind of like muddy relationships with parents that we're trying to set limits with, and we kind of let them into our life and we don't let them into our life. I see this a lot with you know, parents who have children who have substance use problems. It's really, really hard because they can't end it, right? So it kind of like lives on in zombie form. And like grieving a zombie is like harder than grieving like, you know, something that's like actually dead. So another important aspect of grief is like things need to be over for you to be able to grieve them easily. And for things that aren't over or things that were never born, right? Like it's so much harder to grieve and accept because you don't really know that it's over. I know it sounds kind of weird. And we'll kind of get to this in a second. So part of the reason for that, and this is actually what we're going to be talking about, is counterfactual thinking. So this is a concept that is, I think, underappreciated, but is like really, really important. So counterfactual thinking is when we think about things that did not factually happen, okay? So the simplest way to understand counterfactual thinking is what ifs. And counterfactual thinking serves a lot of different purposes. So the first thing to understand is that counterfactual thinking actually was not discovered, I think, by wasn't really discovered by psychologists. It was actually discovered by economists, if memory serves correctly. So the early stages of counterfactual thinking research were about bias. And so even Daniel Kahneman, sort of published some papers back in the late 70s about counterfactual thinking and how counterfactual thinking kind of biases us. So what is counterfactual thinking? It's thinking about what ifs. So I'll give you all a simple example. If I had studied more, if I do poorly on a chemistry test, what does my mind do? My mind actually goes back in time and starts to think about all of these things that are factually incorrect. If I had studied more, I would have done better on the chemistry test. If I had gone to office hours, I would have done better. If I had done homework with a group, I would have done better. If I had done this, it would have been better. It would have been better. It would have been better. So we spend a lot of time thinking about things that are not true. And so some of the early people thought that, okay, this is like basically something that's going wrong in the mind, that our mind shouldn't be doing this because we're not thinking about reality. And so a lot of people get really confused because they're like, why do I think about, you know, things that don't exist? Why do I get stuck? Sometimes they're fantasies, but sometimes they're also regrets. Okay? So sometimes they even result in things like maladaptive daydreaming. But we see it in these kinds of relationships, and we'll kind of get into why in a second. So let's take a look at counterfactual thinking and what it does and what some of the functions of counterfactual thinking are, okay? So the first is that here's reality with, action into bad outcome. Okay? So then what our brain does when we have an action into a bad outcome is it engages in counterfactual thinking. Action not taken into good outcome. But this is fantasy or hypothetical. What if? If I had done this, then this. So counterfactual thinking has a couple of interesting effects. The first is that it has a problem-solving or performance improvement aspect. This is huge. So if we did not engage in counterfactual thinking, I know it sounds kind of weird, but we would never, oddly enough, learn from our mistakes. So if I do something one way and then I feel bad afterward and my mind thinks, oh, I should have done it the other way. If I had done it the other way, then it would have turned out okay. And so hopefully what happens is the next time I do it, I will do it the other way and then I'll improve. So counterfactual thinking, our ability to consider options that we did not take, is crucial to our ability to problem solve and actually try things differently. Okay? That's the first thing. The second thing that people discovered is that counterfactual thinking is a method of emotional regulation. Okay? Now, counterfactual thinking actually engages in a couple of different emotions. I know it sounds kind of weird, but there's something called upward counterfactual thinking, and there's also downward counterfactual thinking. So downward counterfactual thinking tends to make us feel good. And I know it sounds kind of weird, but what do you mean by that? So what that means is, generally speaking, if I had an action at a bad outcome, I think about doing it better, right? So what that means is that's an upward counterfactual thinking. I imagine a scenario that is above where I am. And this, interestingly enough, makes us feel regret. So if my hypothesis, if my behavior is here, and my hypothetical thinking is up here, this is upward counterfactual thinking. So I'm actually behaving better. Downward counterfactual thinking is over here. And you guys may be wondering, what is an example of downward factual thinking? Downward factual thinking is, imagine if I had ... Oh my God, imagine if I had not used a condom. Holy crap, would I be screwed? Imagine if I had not packed, nausea medication on my trip on a boat. Okay? So we can imagine scenarios that didn't happen, which are where we end up worse, and that actually feels good, right? So it can help us a lot. So the other thing that people have discovered is that counterfactual thinking actually regulates our emotions. So the other thing to think about is maybe the condom example was extreme, is that regret is actually one of the key ways that forms our behavior in the right direction as well. So when we regret something, why do we experience negative emotions? Let's think about that for a second, right? So negative emotions are a conserved experience amongst human beings. So why the hell does our brain produce regret? It's because in an ideal situation, producing regret will actually give us fuel to go back and change our behavior. So I don't want to regret this ever again. So I missed this flight. I'm never going to miss a flight again. I'm going to go to the airport half an hour early from here on out. And negative emotion actually fuels behavioral change. So we also know that the most powerful emotion that shapes behavior is actually negative emotion. So the amygdala and limbic system are very close to the hippocampus, have a lot of really, really strong connections, which is why you can eat at a restaurant 20 times. And the 21st time, if you get food poisoning, your mind won't say, oh, there's a 3% chance we're going to get food poisoning, 4% chance we're going to get food poisoning. Let's go ahead and eat there. It's probably safe. If you get sick once, your mind is like, one bad event outweighs in our mind 20 good events. Okay? That's why emotions are good, because they actually change our behavior, even negative emotions. Okay? So it helps us for performance improvement and it helps our emotional regulation. Now, when you say it helps our emotional regulation, like what do you mean? Isn't this experiencing negative emotion? Isn't that like unregulating our emotion? So I'm going to give you all a simple example. So if you want to understand counterfactual thinking, there's just one example you need to think about. Think about the psychology of someone who wins the gold medal, the silver medal, and the bronze medal. Who is in an Olympic competition? Who is the happiest out of those three? Okay? Think about it. Let's put it this way. Who is the least happy? Who is the saddest? Okay? So the silver person is the saddest. What kinds of thoughts are they engaging in? The silver person's thinking, right? So the silver person is thinking like, you know, so close. I can be better. If I had done this, I would have won. If. They're engaged in counterfactual upward thinking, and they feel regret. Now, what is the bronze medalist thinking? Right? So the bronze medalist is actually engaging in counterfactual thinking that's downward, right? They're thinking like, oh, thank God I got the bronze. Thank God I practiced as hard as I did. It paid off, right? Gold is kind of like not too sure, to be honest. So, you know, what they're engaging in, because they sort of got the outcome that they wanted, right? So that's kind of weird, whereas like, you know, so I don't know that they're engaging in counterfactual thinking because they got the outcome they wanted. Whether they're happy or not probably depends on a lot of other stuff. Gross generalization that we're doing. But I think this gold, silver, and bronze is like a really good example of, you know, how we engage in thinking, and the direction of our counterfactual thinking will affect our emotional state, right? So the bronze person is like, oh man, like, thank God I wasn't fourth. Boy, would it suck to be fourth, right? Oh, thank God. Thank God I practiced extra. Thank God I, you know, wore my lucky underwear. Thank God all this kind of stuff. Like, if things had gone wrong, then I wouldn't have gotten a medal at all. It would have been so bad to go home without a medal. At least I'm an Olympic medalist. I can live with that, right? Whereas the silver medalist is like, if I needed to do better, if only I had done this, if only I had done this. They engage in a lot of counterfactual thinking. That's upward in direction. I came so close, right? So if you want to understand, it's the best example. So this is why counterfactual thinking is important. So what does it do? For the silver medalist, it can help them feel, it makes them feel kind of some amount of dissatisfaction and regret, hopefully drives them to practice harder next year, hopefully drives them to, you know, like never want to feel that way again. I'm never going to get silver again. Gold or bronze here on out, but never going to be, you know, second place, which is the first loser, right? The highest of the losers is what the silver medal is. And so now we begin to see that there are some of these like weird things going on with like reality and like, you know, what we're attached to, what we're happy with, what we're unhappy with. And so counterfactual thinking sort of explains a lot of these things. Now, there's also like a couple of other important aspects of counterfactual thinking, which we're going to talk about. So the interesting thing is that someone came up with this sort of theory of counterfactual thinking, and then people sort of did some neuroscience studies and some experiments, and basically found that the orbitofrontal cortex is a big part of what engages in counterfactual thinking. And that there are also like content-specific counterfactual thoughts. So this is where we like learn a specific behavior. But then there are also like other aspects of counterfactual thinking, which are content non-specific, which will affect our mindset. So when we engage in this kind of thought, we'll learn particular things to do different next time, but it also alters our mindset. And the interesting thing about mindset is that it alters our information processing. And this is how counterfactual thinking can actually get us into trouble. Because remember that counterfactual thinking can make us feel regret. Okay? So sometimes what we've actually seen is that if you engage in a lot of upward counterfactual thinking, you are potentially more likely to be anxious and depressed. That it sort of correlates with both of these things. And even mental illness has been shown to have correlations. So mental illness equals over counterfactual thinking, and I realize our terms are getting kind of cumbersome, so I'll explain them, or under counterfactual thinking. So there's a healthy amount of counterfactual thinking. There's a healthy amount of asking what ifs. And if we do it too much, we wind up with depression and anxiety. Okay? And you guys may wonder, well, what do you mean? How does that work? Well, remember, this results in regret, right? If I had done this, then I would have won. And then how do I feel emotionally? I feel regret. And then I'm also asking what if, what if, what if, what if. And sometimes the what ifs can be so paralyzing. If only I had done this. So there's lots of ifs. And if we have lots of ifs that get out of control, that's anxiety. The other really interesting thing is that underutilizing counterfactual thinking also results in mental illness or problems, let's say. So one thing that people have looked at is schizophrenia. So people with schizophrenia under-engage in counterfactual thinking. And so what this sort of leads to is motivational problems and lack of improvement. So it's kind of interesting, but like sometimes if we have a lot of problems with motivation, it can actually be like some sort of disordered counterfactual thinking. So like I'm not thinking about how to really do it better. It's not altering my mindset in the right way. And the last thing that's kind of problematic is sometimes we can enter a vicious cycle of unproductive counterfactual thinking. And this is something that we unfortunately see a lot, right? Which is I get caught up in the what ifs, I get caught up in the what ifs, I get caught up in the what ifs. And then I'm filled with regret. It shifts my mindset. My mindset then alters the way I receive information. And then this creates a cognitive bias that Kahneman picked up in 1978, right? Because he's like, oh my God, these people are not processing information correctly. As you don't process information correctly, it's going to negatively impact your life and you start to kind of get stuck, okay? So we can see that like not utilizing counterfactual thinking because we want to use it properly. We want to like problem solve. We want to learn how to do it better. We want to do it better next time. Okay? And now let's go back to dating or relationships. So in relationships, like what's the deal? How does this play in? Okay. So let me put it to you all this way, okay? We're going to run through this. If I am in a honeymoon phase of the relationship, how great is that relationship? Let's say 0 to 10. Okay, let's say that the honeymoon phase, let's say I meet someone who's a 9. And then something falls apart, doesn't go well. Okay, y'all are saying 10, whatever. Okay? Now, let me ask you something. If you lost a relationship that could have been a 9 or a 10, how big of a problem do you think that is for your brain to solve? How important is that a problem for you to solve? Is it 10 importance or 0 importance? 10 being very important, 0 being, okay, huge problem. Okay, so if it's a huge problem to solve, our brain wants to solve it. So what are we going to do? A ton of counterfactual thinking. So what happens when we have a honeymoon phase relationship? It's not even a relationship that kind of falls apart because all it is potential. Then what we start doing, pay attention to what your mind actually does. Your mind is like, oh, I should have done this. I should have done this. Should I have texted? Should I have not texted? What if I had done this? If I had only done this, if I had only done this, I had only done this. And why is that? It's because your brain is realizing, oh crap, this is something we really need to solve. Because why does it want to do this? Next time around, I need to know how to behave perfectly the next time around because I can't let it slip through my fingers again. Because if I meet the perfect person, I can't afford to make this mistake. Right? That's the purpose of counterfactual thinking. It's to prepare you for the next time around. What am I going to do next time? And so we start to obsess over it. Right? Whereas, let's say that I have an existing relationship. Right? Oh, you got divorced. I'm so sorry to hear that. Yeah, it was probably for the best. Right? Everyone who gets divorced, I mean, not everyone, But most people who get divorced at one point were dating someone who was a 9 or a 10 in their mind, right? Because they went through the honeymoon phase. Everything was perfect. Everything was great for the first year. Everything was great until the wedding. And that's when they changed. Everything was great until 2 months after the wedding. Everything was great until this. Y'all get that? Like everyone who's divorced, I mean, not everyone, because I mean, people get married for all kinds of reasons, and sometimes people get married into unhealthy and unhappy relationships. But generally speaking, like most people who get divorced were in a relationship that was a 10 in their mind at some point. And so what happens to a real relationship over time? It becomes a 6 or a 7. Reality sets in, right? The negatives start to set in. And so now let's think about this. If I lose someone who's a 6 or 7, am I going to engage in more or less counterfactual thinking than the above scenario? What do y'all think? Right? Less. Because it's not as important. Right? Some people are saying more, maybe more. Okay, so this is where like you have to study it for yourself and see. We're making generalizations here, but generally speaking, the more important something is to us, the more we value something, the more our brain is going to try to solve for it like going well and in our favor. Okay? And so now like, and then if we think about, you know, going back to this thing, harder to get over. So let's talk for a second about what it means to get over, right? Get over means like be at peace with it and stop thinking about it. So there's an element of grief that we talked about, sure. But if I'm engaging in a bunch of problem solving and counterfactual thinking because I want to make it, you know, proper, and remember, the more counterfactual thinking we engage in, chances are we're going to experience more regret, which then feels kind of weird because we're like super confused. So like, you know, which of these scenarios is going to experience more regret and which one are we going to be thinking more about? So next time around, so more regret, more thoughts. And then over here, we've got less regret and less thoughts. It's not necessarily the case, right? So like you may have grief and stuff here that's more present. So you can get kind of stuck in grief in this scenario more, I think. But it's hard to finish. So it's easier to get stuck in grief in this scenario, but it's actually harder to start grieving in this scenario. Does that make sense? Because like you're confused. Whereas like this, you have something to grieve, and if you don't grieve properly, you're going to think more. Maybe you'll have a ton of counterfactual thoughts. It's not like you're, you know, these are generalizations. But the key thing here is that once we look at the like kind of the neuroscience and psychology of counterfactual thinking, once we understand like why our brain, you know, focuses on things that could have been, then we can understand why it's actually not crazy that like we spend more time getting caught up in things that like weren't as real as the things that we've experienced. Because at the end of the day, what's our brain doing? If there's so much potential, our brain wants to lock in that potential next time. We don't want to make that mistake again. And the more potential there was, like the more we want to lock it in. Therefore, we're going to be thinking about it more. And remember, the other thing is early on in the relationship, you have a lot more what ifs, right? There are so many early decision trees that can butterfly effect out, and your mind thinks through all of those possibilities. Whereas things are like more determined, and we see like the less good side of our partner, so it's easier to move on from some of the relationships that we've had. So is that honeymoon phase? Sure. Is that a piece of it? Absolutely. There's this weird grief thing where it's like hard to grieve something that was never alive and hasn't really ended, just sort of fizzled, right? It's hard to get a sense of closure from these relationships of potential that like didn't really end. Because even then, it's like if you went on 2 dates and like you never heard from them again, or they moved to a different country, you don't even have like a breakup conversation. And it's like if you try to have a breakup conversation, like that's weird, right? Like you have a breakup conversation, like you can have closure, you can have grieving, you can say goodbye. But it's like, hey, girl I met in the stairwell of a wedding for 30 minutes, like how do I, like you can't say goodbye to that person, right? It's kind of weird. So it's hard to grieve. It's hard to get closure. So it's hard to like move on from that Because it's like, what are you even grieving? There wasn't something there, but it feels kind of weird. And the last thing is this counterfactual thinking, which is that we want to optimize that potential. We don't want to make that same mistake again. That regret is moving us to think through things and how we're going to behave. And the more that we engage in it, when we think about getting over, it's closure, but it's also like before you've gotten over something, it's rolling around in your head over and over and over again. And sometimes in these potential relationships, there's so much more of this kind of thinking involved. So it feels way more active because, counterfactual thinking is about hypotheticals. But when you've been dating someone for 2 years, a lot of those hypotheticals have been answered, right? You actually have data, so it's no longer hypothetical. So there's no more like what ifs to think about, or there are fewer what ifs. You know the person better. So it's really interesting. But if you all get kind of stuck, hung up in relationships that oddly enough don't feel as real to you as some of your real relationships, it's not like you're screwed up. It's not like you have trouble getting over things or things like that. There are actually a lot of bizarre things that are going on, like in your orbitofrontal cortex, and things that have been studied by Nobel Prize winning economists, right? Where they didn't win the Nobel Prize for this, but like there are studies where, people who are very, very competent in their fields and very smart have taken this seriously and observed it to be real, as well as psychologists. And so you're not crazy, and like it's completely normal, right? So just recognize what your mind is trying to do and even support it to some degree. And that's where you can sort of say like, okay, so now that you realize that your brain is engaging in these thoughts, why? Because the next time I have this opportunity, I want to do it right. And then you can consciously engage in that process and bring that thought process to a close. You can say, okay, so like at the end of the day on a piece of paper, what are the 3 or 4 things I want to take away from this relationship? Instead of thinking about this person, what do I want to take away from it? If this happens again next time, I'm going to let them know how I feel, even if it's a little bit early, right? Or I'm going to have a conversation about like DTR, defining the relationship. I'm going to do that earlier. Or I'm going to exchange contact information. Right? So like there are certain things that you can kind of process and take away from. So oddly enough, it's very common. Questions? That's a good question. Does there exist a Nobel Prize or equivalent to that for psychology? I actually don't. I know there's a Nobel Prize in physiology and medicine. I don't know. What do y'all think? Do people know? Okay, physics, chemistry, physiology or medicine, literature, and peace. There's got to be, and economic. Right? So maybe in physiology and in medicine, but that's the closest thing. Can a lot of this same stuff be said about long-term relationships that one person didn't want to end? Possibly, yeah. But I mean, I think that's where, so the thing about counterfactual thinking is that it's like a core part of like human psychology and neuroscience. It happens. So it can be applied to all kinds of things. It applies to studying, it applies to, Olympic competitions, it applies to relationships. It's actually a really huge part of like motivation circuitry. Right? Okay. Don't want to meditate? Okay, so it's the Grawemeyer Prize. Thank you for sharing. What is the potential process who says it was a bad decision, but it was my decision? I'm not quite sure. So generally speaking, I think that's a good thing. So I think it's important to own your decisions and recognize that, you could be making a mistake. Like, that's okay, I think. Yeah, so someone's saying that, like, This applies to my countless rejected love crushes, 2 crushes that gave pretty much impacted me deeply these past 3 or 4 years. Absolutely, right? So this is the kind of thing that like the problem is that we think we're so screwed up when we get rejected by someone who we don't have too much of a relationship. Like we assume for some reason that our hurt and our grief should be like the greatest for a certain length of relationship. And that makes sense, right? If you've been married to someone for like 30 years, like you're going to grieve more than someone you've been dating for 2 weeks. So that's true. But there's this other side of it that like somewhere in the middle, there's the 1-year relationship, 2-year relationship that for me seems like the lowest period of grief. Whereas even the 2-week or 2-month relationship can feel so much more rejecting and you can get hung up on so much easier. And that's not because you're an idiot who can't let go, right? Like that's what we assume is we think we're like somehow screwed up, but no, it's not like that at all. Okay. So someone's asking, how can I disconnect my self-worth from my favorite person's perceivable actions, feelings about me? A couple of different things. The first thing is that it's not actually self-worth, right? If it's determined by its worth, but if it's determined by your favorite person's actions, then it's not self-worth. So it's worth. So self-worth comes from you, right? So the interesting thing there is if you're kind of like addicted to someone else's perception of you and you just feel so good. I know it's kind of hard, but you have to start to wean yourself off of that, right? You have to start to cultivate self-worth. So self-worth tends to come from challenges. It tends to come from private things. So I know it sounds really, really simple, but like if you crave the respect and appreciation of a particular person, I would do things that you can be proud of and not tell them. Right? And it's going to feel like really, really hard, but you should do that. So like, if you climb a mountain, like don't tell them. And then you're going to like, if they ask about it, like you can mention it, like you don't necessarily need to hide it. But oftentimes what we do is we engender that dependence by like reaching out to the person, right? So do something that you can be proud of and don't tell a soul. And then like try to see, do I feel pride of this? Like, what does it feel like to not share it? And this is becoming increasingly common in the world of social media. Because what's the value of something if I don't post it? Does it go up or does it go down? Right? So now what's happening is we have a society in which our accomplishments, it's so much easier for our accomplishments to be like judged and us to get praise from the outside world. So like do something if you're addicted to someone else's esteem, do things that you could theoretically be proud of and don't tell them and then see what happens to your esteem. It's going to be really painful, but just don't tell them. Then as you do it more and more and more, right, you may notice some weird things. Like after you engage in the behavior, you don't feel like doing it anymore. And then like ask yourself why. Like, why don't I want to go hiking again? And then you'll realize it's because I didn't get the response that I'm used to getting. Normally I would share it with them. They would praise me, and then I'd feel amazing. But since I didn't get that reward, I don't want to engage in it again. And then you go hiking again and don't tell them. Learn to cook something new. Start exercising. Do something that you can be proud of, but don't tell a damn soul. And then at some point, as you start to wean yourself off of their praise and start to do things that you can be proud of, you will actually start to feel pride in them. Right? It's got to like, you got to wean yourself off while at the same time doing things that you can be proud of. Yeah, so Chinese cabbage farmer is saying, this is such an important lesson, but man, I crave praise. Absolutely. So do you know why people crave praise? Because they haven't figured out how to farm it within themselves. Makes sense. There's nothing wrong with you. Right? So it's like, this is where like, it's worth. So where have you learned to get worth from? Right? And our society is becoming increasingly common where like more and more worth comes from the outside. And this is where, depending on, I don't know if you guys have seen, the Dr. K's guide video about conditional love, right? But we talk about that in there, where like some people are like literally taught that your worth comes from the outside, that internal worth is like not a thing. It's conditional love. Did you get an A? Let me love you. Did you get a B? Let me not love you. And so we're not weak. Like we think like, oh my God, like I don't have self-worth. Like I'm so reliant. I'm so pathetic. I'm reliant on the praise of others. No, I mean, you're reliant on the praise of others because you never had to learn how to get it from yourself. You had a source of it. It's a toxic source, ugly source, but it's a source. All right? We grow up becoming reliant on all kinds of things that we have steady sources of. You know, I'm reliant, like I don't know how to pump water from a well because I get it through indoor plumbing. Like I never had to learn that. It doesn't make me a pathetic person. It just means that I've had one source of it. And if at some point I decide that the plumbing is no longer working and I need to go get water myself, like that's something that I have to grow into. So be patient with yourself, be compassionate with yourself, and like start to like cultivate that worth that comes from within. Okay? Okay. Let's meditate. So, I'm going to teach y'all cool meditation about the indriyas, okay? So, a lot of what we've talked about today is our mind controlling parts of us, okay? So like when our mind generates thoughts or when it generates emotions, it shapes what we do. It's in control of us. So we tend to think about some things as outside the world that come into us, we process, and then we take actions, right? So I have inputs and I have outputs. And my behaviors are the outputs, and like my sensory inputs are the inputs. So we tend to think about the senses. So if someone says, you know, you're a good person, or the praise of others, right? If someone praises you, that's a sensory input. And we think about the mind as feeling better, and that's kind of the output. The interesting thing that I want y'all to notice is that if you practice something called pratyahara, which we're going to explain, which is sensory withdrawal, and if you understand the sense organs, what you'll discover is that there are not 5 sense organs. There are actually 7. Okay? I know it sounds kind of weird. But we have touch, smell, taste, sound, sight, mind, and ego. So mind and ego are actually sensory inputs. They are not outputs. And I know it sounds kind of weird, but how do we determine what a sense is? A sense is something that we observe, right? Ego is absolutely sensory input. We'll explain. So it's like something that we see, right? That's what the sense organ is. And I don't mean sight, but I mean that we observe a particular sense organ, right? Like we observe the consequence, like it's like an input. So if I am aware of what I see, sight is a sense organ. If I'm aware of what I hear, that's like information that's coming in, right? Through awareness. But the interesting thing is that what is an emotion? An emotion is actually information coming in too. I can observe my anger, and then it becomes an input. It's not an output. It's an input. Even my ego, my thoughts, I can be aware of those thoughts. Therefore, they actually move into the category of sensory inputs because I'm collecting information. So the other way we can think about indriyas or sense organs is they're what give us information about things, right? That's what it is. So with my sight, I can see things. I can learn about the world. I can learn about stuff. I understand where things are. The other interesting thing is like, does our mind and our identity give us information? Absolutely. 100%. And that moves them into the sensory category, right? They generate stimuli for us to process. So what we're going to do today, and once you realize this, once you realize that your mind is not what controls you, but what feeds you information, it will be revolutionary for your ability to control things. Because then suddenly, all it is a sight. All it is a sound. Because the key thing here is that once you recognize that that thing is outside of you, you can change the way that you respond to it. So someone can call me an idiot, but once I realize that that's just their opinion and they're out here and how I react to it is under my control, I gain a power over that thing. When I lose sight of the fact that someone is, calling me an idiot and I let it come in and I let it shape me, when I don't draw a barrier, when I don't put up a wall between me and the sensory input, that sensory input controls me, right? That's what we see with Karens. They get controlled by their sensory inputs. They're not in control of themselves. So if something is out of stock, they start yelling and screaming. So how do you gain control over yourself? You put a wall between you and your sensory inputs. I'm not saying that you ignore them and close your eyes. What I'm saying is that your capacity to react to them can change. So if someone says you're an idiot and you have a good wall of your indriyas, it doesn't come in and affect your ego. You can say, okay, cool. Like, I'm sorry, what did I do? Help me understand why I'm an idiot. Because maybe you made a mistake. Maybe you are an idiot. Gasp. Maybe you're an idiot. I've been an idiot before. Chances are you've been an idiot before, right? Like, we all make mistakes. Maybe there's something to what they say. Now, the interesting thing is, in the same way that we put up a wall, we don't put up a wall with our own emotions and our own identity. We assume that these things are true, right? If I feel something, it must be true. We equate our feelings to the outside world. We equate our identity thoughts to the outside world. And we don't put up barriers between them. We don't judge them. So even things like if you look at cognitive behavioral therapy systematically teaches people to question and reframe their own thoughts. So then their thoughts become observations that you put into a thought log. They don't become truth. So cognitive behavioral therapy is a systematic process of taking your thoughts and treating them as sensory inputs. So we can practice that through meditation as well. Okay? So if you all have a clinical concern, I'd highly recommend, an actual therapist to do this with. But we can practice this. So all we're going to do today is notice that we can observe all of our indriyas. And in that same way that we observe the indriya, we can observe, which is a sense organ, we can also observe an emotion and a sense of identity or a thought. And if we can observe all of them, that means all of it is on the outside and all of it is information that we can let in and process how we want to. Okay? So we're going to start by sitting up straight. Indriyas are senses. That's correct. Okay? So I'm going to sit up straight. And first thing that we're going to do is close our eyes, and we're just going to breathe. Okay. So now the first sense that we're going to start with is smell. So chances are that if you're just breathing in, you may not smell very much because generally speaking, we acclimatize to a smell. So if you have any object, so I have some tea here, so you could just go ahead and smell it. It doesn't have to be tea. You can smell a pen, you can smell a rock, you can smell water, you can smell, I have some lotion here. You can smell whatever. And the key thing to zero in on is that this is something that you are on the inside and this thing is coming from the outside in. Just notice the observation. There may be some kind of reaction. You may think you like it, you dislike it. And then if you have something available, you can even taste. Otherwise, you can just notice the taste in your mouth. And once again, what I want you to zero in on is the indriya, the sensory input, potentially the reaction. You may notice that it creates a desire, but that desire is within you and is actually separate from the indriya, from the sensory input. right? So I'm noticing the residual taste now. So try to see this mechanism of stimulus and response. So now we're going to zero in on sound. So as I speak, I want you to notice my words, how they enter in, and how you can respond to them. So you can listen to what I'm saying, or maybe you haven't listened to what I'm saying. You know, I notice that some people will continue typing in chat. Some people may be listening to this later and are doing housework or something like that. That the sensory input of my voice is there, but your reaction to it can change. So now I'll go like this. Unga bunga, unga bunga, unga bunga, unga bunga, unga bunga. And as I say that, notice what happens within. Are you able to observe that with passivity? Or does it create a reaction? Do you give in to that reaction? Ready? We're going to do it again. Unga bunga, unga bunga, unga bunga, unga bunga. Buga buga. Unga. Just listen to the sounds. Unga bunga, unga bunga, unga bunga, unga bunga. Bunga bunga. Notice your anticipation. Notice your engagement with the sound. You may notice a small reaction, a smile, but it's just sounds. So now, as we can see, if you listen to my words, you're maybe listening to my instructions. You'll notice that the sound penetrates. The indriya can't just observe, it must react. But as we observe, your ability to react will strengthen, or your ability to not react will strengthen. Unga bunga, unga bunga, unga bunga, unga bunga. Bunga bunga. And now I want you to feel your body. And notice how your body is sending you sensations. It may want to move. It may want to shift. It may want to scratch something. You may feel hungry. And that these too are sensations. That through observing them, you don't necessarily have to react to them. That sometimes we react very strongly to hunger and we have to eat. Sometimes we feel uncomfortable and we have to move. But that you can separate out your actions and how much your sensory inputs control you through observation. The more that you put it outside of you, the less in control of you it is. So notice your sensations. Notice what they want you to do. But as you observe them, notice that the power for them to control you diminishes. And that the most we shift throughout the day is when we are completely unaware of the shifting. So notice your sensations. And now we'll open our eyes and notice all the inputs. If you're watching me, or if you've been watching the stream, I notice there are people who are typing in chat. Notice, where does that desire to type come from? It's being triggered by your senses. As I say something, or as I make a facial expression, you cannot resist. You got to keep typing. Right? So it's kind of interesting. We'll see. People have to give in. So notice where that desire comes from. Now that I'm talking about it, now I'm challenging you to not type. Right? So stop typing. Now you've gotten the sensory input. Are you able to observe that sensory input without reacting? It's difficult. Right? So notice what's happening there. Okay, so we are even seeing, I have a desire to be part of something. Very good. So now we're going to transition to the next thing. So if you want to close your eyes again. And now in the same way that you've noticed the capacity for observation, you can do that with your ahamkara, your ego, as well as your manas or emotions. That you can observe the judgment or the like or the dislike of the manas. You can observe an emotion. Oftentimes, the emotion is on the inside of us and controls us. But by observing the emotion, what we actually realize is that our mind is a source of information, no different from sight, sound, touch, smell, or taste. That's all the mind is, a source of information. And this is where it can be a little bit tricky, but for those of you who understand what the manas and the ahamkara is, notice that there are two things that we can observe. One is emotions and judgment, which are just the raw emotions. And the second is the thoughts, the identities, the conclusions of the ahamkara. The desires. Desire is not an emotion. Right? So as I have a desire that is not fulfilled, it will create an emotion. And both of these things I can observe. If I can observe them, they are outside of me. If they are outside of me, I can control them. I can control my reaction to them. The smell of pizza is outside of me. I can restrain my attention, I can gain control of it, and I cannot eat the pizza. In the same way, even my thoughts and my emotions are actually sensory organs. They're ways of the observer to get information. And therefore, they do not need to control you. And so practice this. Observe. And the more that you observe, you will gain control over. It doesn't, because reaction is action without observation. And so if you want to stop living a reactionary life, the most powerful things that we react to are actually our mind. Those are the inputs which we treat as internal. We don't treat them as inputs. And by training our capacity for observation, through closing our eyes, noticing, so you can use whichever sensory organ, whichever of the 5 sensory organs feels the most natural to you. So which of your sensations can you notice the distance between observation and reaction? Spend more time with that sense. The more time you spend with that sense, and then move over to emotion or thought or identity. And the more you move towards that, the more you will be able to control your thoughts and your emotions. We had someone earlier ask about, what if I'm dependent on the praise of others? You're only dependent on the praise of others as long as the praise affects your internal self. When the praise on the outside creates an emotion on the inside, and that is your output, if the emotion is your output, you will always be a slave to what the other person says. The more that you realize that the emotion itself is an observation and that you are free of that, then you will be free of them. So it's a subtler sense organ, but it can be observed. It provides you with information. Therefore, it's a sense organ. That's all it is. It is not the arbiter of truth, no more than your eyes or your ears are. Right? Practice this for about 10 minutes a day. I think it goes very well with a formal meditation dharana. So this is more inquisitive in nature. So I'd start with something like alternate nostril breathing or chanting, and then do this practice afterward. So any kind of breathing practice in which you're changing your breathing or active meditation should be done first, and this can be done second. Okay? So you don't have to, so a couple questions. You don't have to resist feeling positive if you get praised. Resisting is internal. Just notice how I feel. Notice it fully. Be like, wow, when that person says that, my mind really loves it. Observe that sense of praise. So here's the key thing. When you feel praised and you do not observe it, it fills you up on the inside, makes you feel amazing. Instead, what you need to do is look at it, and it'll leave you, right? It's like dissecting a joke. The more you dissect a joke, the less funny it becomes. The more you observe internally something, the more external it will be. Because if you're observing it, if I'm observing it, I'm here and it's there. It's no longer within me. Does that make sense? So it doesn't matter. So someone's saying, what if I don't feel anything when being praised? It doesn't matter. So then observe the nothingness. Observation. Everyone gets caught up in the object of observation, but it is the observing that's the important part, right? This is why there's so many different meditations. Because like, what do they share? They share that common aspect of observation. Sakshi bhav, or mindfulness. First step. See, people are getting caught up. They're saying, why do you want to stop the good feelings? I never said I wanted to stop them. I'm just saying observe them. Why do you want to stop the good feelings? Why do you want the good feelings to no longer control you and fill you up? You don't want them to fill you up because then they'll control you. Why don't you want them to control you? Because generally speaking, you don't want anything to control you. You want to be in control. Because if the good feelings are in control, that's how people get into addiction. That's how people enter into manipulative relationships. Right? Conditional love. Psychologically very damaging. It's about control. Okay. Who are we rating, chat? Yeah, so an actress is saying, observing the situation makes you more aware and therefore gives you more control. That's what I'm hypothesizing. You have to figure out whether that's true or false. That's why I'm saying observe and notice what the act of observation does. It puts it outside of you. If it's outside of you, does it control you as much? That's the question you have to answer through practicing this technique for 8 weeks. Okay, we'll raid Maya. It's just Maya, right? Oh my God. Maya's teaching a donkey how to paint? That's amazing. All right. Send Maya some love. We'll see y'all on Wednesday, okay? Take care.